Hi folks, and welcome to the Ace Tanker for the T-29, the Tier 3 Soviet medium tank that we received recently as a gift tank. Now originally we were actually supposed to receive this tank way back in August of last year as the 7th anniversary gift from Wargaming, but last year Wargaming decided that they weren't going to be giving out tanks as anniversary gifts anymore, and it meant that this tank basically just hung around in the game files until December, and we received it in December instead. But anyhow, this is my first game in the tank. I didn't know much about it, and I kind of went into this game as an experiment, and you're pretty much going to see that as I'm playing it. But as for the history, this is a tank that really surprised me, because the history on the surface isn't that interesting. Essentially the official history, or the surface history for this tank, is that it was a successor, as its name suggests, the T-29, to the original Russian medium tank, the T-28. So it looks like a T-28, but, it received a Christie suspension, and that made the tank slightly bigger because of the suspension, but it was cancelled in favour of the T-34, and it never went into production, basically, even though it performed quite well in its trials, because the suspension was considered more complicated than the one on the T-28, but and more prone to faults, and basically that's the official reason it never went into production. But there's a time gap between this tank and the development of the T-34, and the more I dug into this tank and the more I read about the history, got into some Russian files that I had to translate, this turned into an extremely interesting tank, because the surface history, not that interesting. T-28 with Christie suspension, full stop. Didn't go into production, only a few prototypes were built, and it was too complicated. That's pretty much the history. But the unofficial history, or the history as you dig deeper, is a heck of a lot more interesting, because this was the fifth. Well, I'll argue that in a moment, but there were basically 5 versions of this tank, and 3 of those versions were vastly different from each other as regards its hull type, as regards its armor, as regards its speed. So this is the T-29-5, which was a prototype. It was built. But there was also a T-29-4, which looked very similar to this tank, but could travel at 60 kilometers an hour and had 20 millimeters of armor compared to the 30 millimeters of armor on this one. So less well armored, but much faster, much top speed, much better top speed, much better power to weight ratio. So it had the same armament, but would have been a much faster, more mobile tank, and would be completely overpowered at Tier 3, which, again leads me to the question of why this is a Tier 3. Surely it should be a Tier 4. So this is the T-29-5, but the T-29-4 was a faster, more mobile, lightly armoured version of this tank, but had the same firepower. And then there were the previous 3 versions, which weren't built but exist in plans, and again, they're very different tanks. The first 3 versions were basically lightly armoured, fast, and didn't have these machine gun sponsons on front, or at least didn't have both of them, so slightly different hull shape for the original 3 in the original plans. But then this tank, as I say, I kept on digging, and I got deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, and I discovered that not only is this the 5th version of the T-29, but it has characteristics from the 4th version of the T-29, the T-29-4, so this is kind of like a hybrid tank in-game. Not only have Wargaming nerfed its historical stats to make it fit in at Tier 3, but also it's a hybrid between the T-29-4 and the T-29-5, both of which were prototypes. So this has a crew of 5, but if this is the 30-ton, 30mm armoured version of the tank, which it is in-game, it should have a crew of 6. So they kind of took elements from 2 tanks and they combined them into one and called it the T-29. And not only that, but there were variants of this particular tank, mainly related to its gun and the type of armor it used. So I ended up finding out about 8 tanks that I had no knowledge of prior to this tank being added into the game. And each of those tanks are sufficiently, or at least 5 of them are sufficiently different from each other to be added into the game as, in their own rights. So I don't want to go into all of that history now and the unofficial history, but I will say that one of the designers for this tank was a guy called M.I. Koshkin. Now, if you know of M.I. Koshkin, then you're very, historically educated tanker, because he's the guy who designed the T-34. So the designer for the T-34 that officially, this tank was never mass produced because it was replaced by the T-34. The designer for T-34 worked on this tank as well. So anyway, that's a bit of official history, but there's unofficial history as regards why it didn't go into production as well. And I'll cover all of that and maybe more information about the variants in another video. If you're interested, let me know in the comments, or maybe when I get around to doing an Is It Worth It for this tank, I'll go into it in a little bit more detail. But on the surface, basically, this is a hybrid of the T-29 Soviet-Russian medium tank. It's a kind of combination of a couple of different variations, and it's at Tier 3. So how exactly does a Tier 3 built to replace a Tier 4 work in-game? Well, essentially, the T-29 at Tier 3 is a slightly worse version than the T-28 stock at Tier 4. So, as far as premium tanks go, I mean, I've been hearing a lot of people say this is a very good premium tank, and I would agree. I think the T-29 is a very, very good Tier 3 premium tank, especially as it's a gift. But, it's not OP. It might be a little bit OP, but that's down to the game balancing at Tier 3, compared to a lot of the other Tier 3s. But, as regards Wargaming's policy of the one they tend to ignore quite a bit of releasing premium tanks that aren't as good or better than stock versions of the tank in game, or not quite as good as fully upgraded versions, it's not OP, because what they've done to balance the T-29 as a Tier 3 as opposed to a Tier 4, or the Tier 4 it was going to replace, is they've nerfed the DPM. So this is the stock T-28, so I'm not even comparing it to a fully upgraded T-28, the stock T-28 and the fully upgraded premium T-29. So tier difference, but you get a DPM hit. The reload and rate of fire aren't quite as good, so the DPM isn't quite as good. You don't carry as much particular ammo, but you only get 2 shells left, but that's still plenty of ammunition. So this is historically accurate. A 67 shells is historically accurate for the tank. So you get less DPM using the same gun as the stock gun on the Tier 4. However, the gun handling, even though it's not good on the tank, is still better than it is on the stock gun on the T-28. So slightly better aim time, slightly better accuracy, although it's still awful, and better gun handling while moving the tank or during tank traverse. So the gun handling is slightly better, but once again it gets nerfed slightly because it gets only 5 degrees of gun depression compared to 6 on the Tier 4. So, the gun, in all, even though it's got less DPM, better gun handling, and less gun depression, I think the guns even out as the stock gun on the T-28, but that really doesn't matter because you're not going to be using the stock gun on a T-28 for very long before upgrading it. So essentially it's a stock T-28 with minor differences as regards gun. Now when it comes to mobility, this is what interested me, because the T-30 or T-29 5, which is what this tank is closest to, was a 30-ton version of the tank, which is correct. It got 30 millimeters of armor, which is correct, which makes this the T-29 5, but it got its engine power nerfed. The T-29 was built to replace the T-28, so it was actually built to be faster. And the T-29 could get up to, depending on the version of the T-29, could get up to 54 kilometers an hour for the T-29 5, and it could get up to 60 kilometers an hour off-road for the T-29 4. So the top speed has been nerfed. It's slightly slower. It's pretty much the same speed as the Tier 4, but it's nerfed historically. It could do 54 kilometers an hour historically, so it's 10 kilometers an hour slower. But the weight is the same. The power to weight ratio as a result is much worse than the T-28 is at Tier 4, which again is historically inaccurate slightly. The power to weight ratio was actually better on the T-29 than it was on the T-28, but the terrain resistance is better. So overall, the mobility of the tank, even though it gets much worse power to weight ratio, but it's a much heavier tank and the ground resistance is better, so it's actually okay. The turret traverse is not great on the tank, but again it's workable, and the tank traverse is better slightly on paper, but it gets worse ground resistance while turning the tank, so again it pretty much evens out. Armor and health, you can see that the hull is exactly the same armor, even even though technically it's bigger, wider, longer than the hull on the T-28, but it gets the same 30 millimeters of armor on the front, 20 on the sides, 20 on the rear. So, you know, you're going to be bouncing maybe a couple of lower tier tanks, but upper, you know, similar tier, higher tier tanks, no problems going through your armor. And the turret armor is about 5 millimeters worse all round. Also, historically inaccurate, but the view range and the radio range were nerfed because this is a tier 3 as opposed to a tier 4. So less view range, less radio range. Now this is not terrible for a tier 3, but it's not particularly good either. So it's passable, it's usable. So essentially they've nerfed the T-29 in order to make it fit in at tier 3 as opposed to the tank it replaced, which is a tier 4 in-game. But anyway, as I was saying, this is my first game in the tank. Now what you can see is while the countdown was going on, I was actually going through the ammo choices because the ammo is very, very good on this tank. And you can see I'm switching to HE here during the countdown because I was looking at the ammo. 66 millimeters of penetration, 110 damage, 75 millimeters of penetration with the premium ammo, 110 damage, and 38 millimeters of penetration, 164 alpha damage with the HE. That was very, very impressive during the countdown. I was talking to Beyond D, I'm platooned with Beyond D. Beyond D decided to try and do some puppy kicking in his FCM 36 Pack 40 because first game of the tank, I should be in a tier 3 game, but because I'm platooned with Beyond D, we ended up in a tier 4 game. So my very first experience of this tank is in a tier 4 game. So thanks, dude, thank you. But we were laughing about this during the game, during the countdown. I was saying, you know what? I don't know much about this tank. I'm going to be testing out its maneuverability, but I'm looking at these ammo choices during the countdown and I'm saying, you know what? I'm going to derp this game. My first game in the T-29, I'm going to be using it as a derp tank because even though it does get reasonably good AP, it gets reasonably good heat, the HE on this tank looks very, very good. And I'm looking at the enemy team and I'm seeing, okay, so there's an Electo, there's a Stuart, there's lots of T-29s. Remember, T-29, 30 millimeters of armor, and I've got 38 millimeters of penetration on my HE. Look at all these T-29s, IKVs, and a 127, all of which I can derp and pen with the HE. So I said, you know, during the countdown, I'm going to stick with HE for this game. I'm just going to be messing around. I'm going to stick with HE. And Beyond D was saying, well, I'm playing an overpowered tank, so I'm probably going to have an awful game. And I said, oh, don't be like that, dude. But anyway, we're going to advance, and I'm checking out the maneuverability, and I'm up to my top speed of 44 kilometers an hour. Again, a little bit disappointing from the historical 54 kilometers an hour, but, you know, I'm not complaining. It's only a tier 3. So we're moving across, and as I say, I'm experimenting. I don't know much about the view range. I go for a blind shot. One day I'm going to get one of those shots in, but you can see my crew don't seem to be very good. I'm not quite sure what crew I've put in this tank, but my first game in the tank, we're advancing, and I'm just going to be firing HE. I've decided that my very first game, all I'm going to do is fire HE, because I reckon this tank is viable as a derp tank, and you know I love my derp guns, so I'm going to be playing this as a derp tank. We're just going to move up here and set up for the first enemy tank. But, you know, on the mini-map, a lot of tanks are appearing on the ice road, so I'm wondering, is anyone actually going to come down? Oh, here we go. So a shot into the side of the T-29, 172 damage, and I'm already thinking, yes. Yes, HE is viable. HE is viable on this tank. Who wants to deal with 110 alpha when you can get 172 alpha? I know which one I'd prefer, but doesn't seem as if the enemy have sent too many tanks down here, but we're getting rushed through the middle, and I turn around again, keeping an eye on the minimap. You know, I tend to have bad games or I play badly when I'm not watching the minimap. You've got to constantly watch the minimap. So here's me testing out the gun depression. I didn't even know that this only had 5 millimeters of gun depression. But aim. A little bit unfortunate not to pen the side of the M5A1 Stuart, but yeah, okay, not complaining. Alright, we've only done 25 damage that time, but we're getting a little bit of assistance. Again, gonna try and move up. I know there's tanks down. Oh, T-127. Okay, he's probably spotted me. My sixth sense hasn't gone off, so I don't know if I want to deal with a T-127, even though I can pen him because he's got sloped armor. I don't know. There are tanks moving up behind. Yes, there are tanks moving up behind, so we can derp the 5A1 or M5A1. Now we're going to move up and try and... Oh, okay, so there we go. He's done 136 damage. He must be using HE as well. No, hang on. He did 95 damage. There's a difference. I did 136 damage with HE. Missed my shot. Okay, lots of tanks have pushed through the middle. But there's a T-29 here, and once again, 141 damage. So I'm only firing HE. And I'm enjoying the tank. I think I think it's very viable. Unfortunately, Beyond D went down. He died. But now we're being capped, so... Just wondering if there were any more tanks in the middle, because that T-127 was down there. Oh, IKV-72. Okay, I need to get back to cap, but in the meantime, IKV-72, a tank I can pen easily. He's not even looking at me. Open top. I'm firing HE. Aim carefully. Oh, yes. 150 damage. I'll take that. So we're up to 4 kills. Just, as I say, just messing around, derping around, but... Now we're under pressure, and there's a Panzer B2 also obviously playing, because lots of people are playing the T-29, and there's an Electo. So we're going to move up, and where have they gone? Oh, there's the Electo, so we can, again, derp him. So I've got 4 HE shells. Now, I'm a stubborn git. I really am a stubborn git. Now, even though the Panzer B2 is a well-armored tank, in fact, it's incredibly overpowered because it only ever gets top tier, the hull armor is very, very good. The side armor is spaced. It's got side skirts. Yeah, I'm firing HE, so no sign of that Panzer B2, but he's not capping. I'm wondering, is he going up the hill? That was what my thoughts were. Maybe he's going up the hill. So I think I'm going to fall back into a safer position. There's a T-29 here. We've got a B1 capping. Signal range is not great. I've lost contact with the Panzer 3J. We have... and then the BT comes up behind me, the Panzer B2. So what we're going to do is, my plan was, and again I'm being stubborn here, I could switch to premium ammunition, I could switch to AP and aim for his turret, but I decide I'm going to stick with the HE, and yes, even though the accuracy is 0.5 on this tank, I figure, yeah, 51 health, come on, I'm firing HE, 51 health, I'm firing HE, and I do 5 damage, just 5 damage. Oh, he's got a rate of fire. No, I do 0 damage. Oh, no, okay, HE was a mistake. Aiming for his driver's coupe, or driver's... Yeah, okay, never mind. So, alright, I screwed up. I was being stubborn. I refused to switch to premium. I refused to switch to AP, but it was only my first game in the tank and I was testing it out, so I think the HE is viable, but I was very, very disappointed. I could have easily killed that Panzer B2, but for some reason, I thought that the HE was going to be enough to take off 40 hit points of health, but we ended up bouncing 2 HE shells for 0 damage, and only managed to do, what was it, 5 damage to that guy in like 4 HE shells, so a little bit disappointed with the performance of the HE against a heavily armoured tank, but regardless, it ended up being a win. Our Panzer 3J and our B1 decided to cap out, but yeah, first game of the tank, and we ended up back in the garage. And it was an ace, even though I was just literally derping around. I was testing out the tank with the derp gun, only firing HE, and we had managed to ace it on its first game. And I was happy, and Beyond D was unhappy, because he'd had a bad game, and it seems that every time I decide to play a tank for the first time and ace it, it's in a game with him where he's had a terrible game. So, first game of the tank, Tier 3, Tier 4 game, which really shouldn't have happened if I wasn't platooned, and we did okay, and I think I can fairly say confidently say now that T-29 as a derp tank with firing HE exclusively is okay. It is viable. Unfortunately, as you saw when we ran into the B2 at the end, or the Panzer B2, yeah, HE is not going to work in every situation. I just still can't believe that 3 or 4 HE shells did so little damage to that Panzer B2, but I was stubborn and it cost me my life. Thankfully the team won, we ended up getting the ace, and yeah, okay, I quite like the HE on this tank. So first game of the tank, 802 XP was enough to ace it. I think I've played 1 game in it since. I'm going to be testing it out with the other ammo types, so I'm going to be reviewing it, so I'm going to have to spend a day in the tank sometime. I don't think it's going to be a painful experience, but Apparently on the day I was playing it, 802 was enough to pick up an ace. 865 damage firing HE exclusively with 5 kills was enough. We finished firing 13 shots, managed to hit 10, pen 8. So HE is definitely viable. The accuracy is not good on the tank, but if you let it aim in fully, it seems to be okay. And we received 6 hits and 5 pen. So, you know, you don't have a lot of armor. Only 30mm, 20 on the side and rear. So most tanks that shoot you are going to be able to pen you, and even if they're lower tier and are bouncing on your hull, your turret is only 20mm all round. So if you do come across one of these tanks on the battlefield and you happen to be in a tier 2, every tier 2 has more than 20mm of penetration, so just go for the turret. We spotted 2, damaged 7, destroyed 5, 67 assistance damage, and finished up with 24,000 credits, which ain't too shabby in a tier 3. I'm wondering, is the AP more expensive, or whether or not I would have made as many credits firing AP as opposed to HE. But anyway, we'll find that out when it's time to play the tank in more detail. So 1203 XP on a premium account on a ×3 left me on 4,000 XP overall. So, whoops, don't want to upload. I want to go back. Personal score, there we go. So yeah, T-29, I'm impressed. And not only am I impressed by the performance in its first game, I'm impressed by its stats. It seems to be a very, very solid tier 3. And I'm impressed by its history, because I really wasn't expecting to find out much, and I ended up going down this incredibly deep rabbit hole and discovering all sorts of wonderful tanks and war machines that I'd never heard of. So they've all been added to my list to talk about sometime in the future, either in a separate video or in an Is It Worth It? So let me know what you think. Did you sell this tank for its garage slot, or have you decided to keep it because it is quite a competitive tier 3? I quite enjoyed it, and I think this first game shows that it's got a very good choice of ammunition, and it shouldn't have very many difficulties dealing with higher tier opponents. So yep, I think I'm going to quite like the T-29. I think this is going to be a pleasurable tank to sit in for a day and do a review, but let me know what your thoughts are on the tank. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.